Chapter 4. Bucking the System. There is a sociology of black citizens that is as unknown to white thought as are the strange complications of Sanskrit to English-speaking hearers. The slave-owning mentality of American whites is such that the proper place of blacks is never far from the thoughts of most of them. In thousands of small and large ways, the demeaned place in society is part of America's daily drama. It is as though being black is a crime in itself, and that those who are black chose the color of their skins after deliberate premeditation before being born. The idea is no less ridiculous than blaming a black for his own lynching and accusing him of being black so that that event was certain to occur. The American dilemma is really no dilemma at all. It is the paradox of a national obstinance, fostered, treasured, codified, and carefully managed. The dilemma, in fact, is the white problem, and no less a dilemma than a counterfeit paradox of constitutional libertarianism never intended to serve blacks at all. Many whites who become judges, both in New York and in other parts of America, have been reared in a poisonous atmosphere. Racist emotions have been a polluting fallout, tainting those with a white skin, giving generation upon generation a continuing confirmation of the religion of the white skin's entitlement to privilege. The caste system has come to seem one of America's properties. Blacks with a well-expressed intelligence quotient are thought of as freaks, and, in a manner of speaking, it may be supposed that they are because they have survived without those mental defects that warrant confinement. Insults to the black persona, official and unofficial, are daily accumulations, as though to serve as reminders of history as a threat. Although respectable and conservative whites have organized charitable projects to welcome Vietnamese orphans and other survivors of America's lost cause in the Orient, African refugees from the residue and ravages of colonialism have never been the beneficiaries of any relocation undertaking. American immigration laws still favor those lands that produce blonde, blue-eyed seekers of opportunity and severely limit the dark-skinned who strive for admission to this country. There appears to be a fostered belief that blacks have a higher tolerance for pain than whites, and are more peacefully stoical about deprivation. True, it is that rude hardships have become the norm, and it seems that the tolerance of blacks for suffering in America is exceeded only by their unswerving allegiance to the country as a place to live and die. Presumably, my former colleagues on the criminal court, especially those of my own age group, have been affected by two-toned Americanism. Some of them, when pressed about their pre-1960s visits to Florida, would profess not to have been aware of the racism that sent blacks to the back of the bus or Jim Crowed them in the trains that traveled through the South, or barred them from restaurants, public parks, libraries, and universities. Such ignorance alone should have barred them from high office. One criminal court judge once asked me why I never ate lunch in the judge's lunchroom and remained aloof. Thereafter he invited me to lunch at a nearby restaurant and made obvious efforts to win my confidence, suggesting that our families exchange visits, have dinner, and perhaps take a trip together. It was almost as though I had become the personification of Africa, and he a pious missionary, bringing enlightenment to the heathen. I used him as the KGB might use an espionage agent. He became my personal and secret investigator, my eyes and ears focused on my fellow judges. I referred to him as 99, after the Don Adams TV impersonation of a bungling spy. I relied on him to tell me what white judges talked about at their lunch meetings when no black was present, in their moments of relaxation, and in their casual conversations. The reports were hilarious, although presented earnestly and with a straight face. They revealed a pathetic ignorance and, now and then, an incredible illiteracy. I was surprised to learn how many judges suspected that I was engaged in subversive and hate-filled plots to start a Middle East riot, to flee America, to seek instant citizenship elsewhere, and to elope with a white woman. I was amused to learn that it was thought that all Negroes smoked Chesterfields. I had thought that, with the flooding of the cigarette market with new low-tar claims, the old brand names had been swallowed up forever. I think Judge Andrew R. Tyler would have been amazed to learn that in New York City he was regarded as the fearless leader of all blacks. He, incidentally, smokes only a pipe. John Sandifer was, understandably, their most lightly regarded subject. A low-profile Negro, officious and undistinguished, he had come to the bench through his allegiance to those in political power. He seemed a perfect example of how to win friends and influence people. After he passed the New York State Bar examination, his work with the NAACP had made him acceptable as something of a civil libertarian. The truth is that he prospered through the NAACP both socially and commercially. Although there is certainly nothing exceptional with such exploitation, its significance in promoting the historical mission of the country's oldest civil rights movement is less clear. At one point, after becoming a judge, he was in charge of fair employment practices in the city's court system. Black and Hispanic court officers protested that during his tenure they were not promoted and that none were hired. It was not surprising that Sandifer's elevation inspired him to move from a comfortable section of Harlem. He appeased his judicial eminence by fleeing from the black neighbors who had been his clients to take up residence on Central Park West. Among white judges, Edward Dudley is known as the system's favorite black son. His promotions on the judicial totem pole have been unmatched by those of any other black judge, except possibly Herbert Evans, and with less reason. He was a perfect example of the Peter Principle. Ineffective as administrative judge of the city's criminal court, he was made administrator of the civil branch of the state Supreme Court and a member of its appellate team. Within New York's jurisdiction, he became the male Constance Baker Motley, but without her intellectual gifts. He also had been plucked from the legal staff of the NAACP for adoption by those in a position to make black judges. I was known among the judges as one who was crazy and who deliberately opposed the system. I thus forfeited opportunities reserved for those blacks who knew their quiet place and kept it. Gossip had it that I could easily be promoted if I would only remember my place and stop making critical statements about the judicial system and accusing it of being racist. Neither was I supposed to attack the police, many of whom appeared before me every day. It seemed that I was supposed to express gratitude for my position, not be cheeky, and of course not indulge in public expressions about the defects in the criminal justice system. Some of my white colleagues suggested that I hated all white people and that my public remarks proved it. In short, it seemed that I was being chastised for not fully appreciating white condescension and polite contempt. A white judge with whom I served on the criminal court, Joel Tyler, is now a federal magistrate. One morning he stopped me in a public corridor of the courthouse and literally screamed, "You almost ran me down at Canal Street and Broadway." I thought for a moment that he was unveiling a previously unseen sense of humor, but he immediately removed all basis for that supposition by continuing in a loud voice and unmistakable heat, "And the only reason you did it is because I am white." His mood appeared to be the product of a deep-seated chagrin, and I sought to appease it by assuring him that, had I been certain that he was white, I would not have missed. I promised him that I would practice my aim on some worthier whites and get back to him in due course. This response resulted in a description of me as one black man who hates the guts of all whites, as my spy informed me. But because I had a white and affectionately devoted mother, I could smile at such declarative analysis of my taste in skin color. The courthouse walls at 100 Center Street serve as background scenery for the emotional atmosphere that troubles philosophical concepts of justice. Facing the public entrances to the building are concrete engravings of utterances that should have been great and wise. But, as I mentioned earlier, they are the words of slave-owning Thomas Jefferson, and they seem sullied by pomp and fatuity. The public conduct of Thomas Jefferson has always emerged for me as historical posturing, by reason of his deeply held religious convictions, contrasted with his views of Negroes and his holding of them in bondage. Historians have done their faithful bit to apothesize his life, even as they have for Washington. Apologies for slave-owning Christians punctuate the writings about the Founding Fathers, who managed the theft of this country from the Indians. Therefore, the quotations from Jefferson, the official handwriting on the walls of the courthouse, have an extremely hollow ring to some, especially when they speak of the administration of justice. Very few historians have explored the long-lasting relationship between Jefferson and black Sally Hemings. Only recently have blacks had an opportunity to become familiar with some of the more intimate details of that liaison. All of us who profess to admire pure reason scoff at seers, witch doctors, and interpreters of tea leaves. Yet we live by fictions. Even so theoretically objective a discipline as the law thrives on unreality. An entire body of law is known as legal fictions. For example, we are allowed to annul marriages that have produced children. The annulment permits the parties to say they were never married, although the children remain legitimate and bear the true name of the father. History is no exception to the rule of fictions, as is demonstrated by certain facts about the father of America. Only recently we learned that at the same time he was conducting revolution and rebellion against England, he was satisfying vanity by purchasing accessories from London. Early childhood instruction is permitted to cover the warts and foibles of the hero because their revelation might make him human and non-heroic. There are some things, however, about the criminal courts building, with its children's building block lines and its infamy as the home of the tombs, that smack of basic hardline truth. They are not fictions. They reflect the ethos not only of New York City, but of the Christian prejudices of the nation. If the country can be said to have a definable character, it may be found in the scribbled graffiti that leaps out at us from surprising places. The livid messages on the walls inside the various stairwells remained undisturbed for years, as though Holy Writ, one stark legend, greeted all who descended the stairs from the fourth floor. Appropriately enough, at the building's southern end, the words seemed like an aberrant prophecy. Their advice was, "Kill, kill, kill, but kill the niggers, Jews, and Spics first." At last, the blacks had made it to first place in America, and the winning was to be their loss. We had become Nazi America's black Jews. We were the ingredients of what makes apartheid work, and in the halls of justice at that. What is astonishing is not that the words were so carefully placed on the wall in large letters, but that in a courthouse where a large proportion of blacks and Hispanics were supplicants for that elusive wraith, justice, Those offensive words remained for so long a time. Neither blacks who came that way nor others who could not escape the proclamation calling for the death of so many human beings sought to cross out a single syllable. In addition, there were writings beneath the words, such as "Right on" and "Let's do it now." In a city of graffiti and counter-graffiti, the permanence of the insult reflected its tenacious adoption. A certain quality of American anti-Semitism was also revealed by the inscriptions on sidewalks and lampposts, which said, "Jews for Jesus." The most constant subscript added to that legend was, "Who needs them?" Others, like the one prevalent in Harlem saying, "Become Catholic," often had written beneath that advice, "Why?" Why, too, were there no quotations from John Brown, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, or William Wells Brown? Had the blacks unconsciously adopted the death wish expressed for them? It seemed that Ralph Ellison was right in saying that each black is an invisible man when it comes to the benefits of democracy. One of the reasons why I have identified so closely with the struggles of the Jews is because they have had to endure oppressions in America that may be possessed of a stronger and more bitter animus than that reserved for blacks. It was not difficult to notice from time to time that in addition to the Jewish aid given to the black civil rights movement, the Jews had their own causes to espouse at the same time. After World War II, when the United Nations began to flourish in the United States, Russia, with England, France, and America, became one of the Big Four. Many Russians emigrated to America and especially to New York. They brought many stories of Jewish persecution in the Soviet Union. By the early 1970s, a radical youth movement known as the Jewish Defense League, JDL, had become prominent. One of the causes to which it was dedicated was pointing up and publicizing what the Soviet Union was doing to its Jewish citizens, especially those who sought to emigrate to Israel. Often the JDL's conduct took the form of picketing and other demonstrations against the Russians accredited to the United Nations. The JDL never hesitated to show the distaste of its members towards Soviet diplomats. Some of them were accused of daubing or splashing red paint on the buildings occupied by Moscow's representatives. Some even of discharging a rifle in the direction of the Russian residents. Several of those cases had come before my bench. The slogan of the youthful Jewish militants was, "Never again." I understood its adamant sentiment perfectly. Such a brave and hopeful cry should have been usurped by the NAACP because blacks had been slaves. Obviously, the League was not deluded into thinking that it can't happen here. They remembered the fate of the millions of Jews in Europe who thought that the Holocaust could not happen there. Such thoughts, as history has revealed, were little more than a bleak placebo. Young Jews appear to believe that it makes better sense to come out fighting. They are as aware as I am of the latent and often overt anti-Semitism in America and the rest of the world. As recently as April 1986, the New York Times reported from Dusseldorf that its mayor spoke of killing a few rich Jews to balance the city's budget. The local Jewish organization, obviously respectable and without the JDL's passion, urged the dropping of charges against the mayor after he donated $41,000 to a children's cancer hospital. He doubtless claimed a substantial tax benefit. The JDL knows that discrimination must be fought without let-up. They know, as I do, that prejudice must be publicly attacked by all who oppose it, even and especially if one is a judge. I hope I have exerted some of the same angry passions as those that energized the Jewish Defense League. The last will and testament of Frederick Douglass bequeathed to all blacks the admonition, Agitate, agitate, agitate. The purpose of the Jewish agitation is in the cause of not permitting any further national atrocities to promote a Nazi-like final solution. The purpose of black agitation should be in the cause of not permitting the Christian morality of American democracy to sink once again into holding blacks in bondage, and to work to heal America of its racism. Whenever prosecutions of Jewish Defense League members came before me, I always felt a keen sense of identification with the necessity to struggle and to agitate. After all, it seemed to me that JDL's members were often treated as white niggers. To respectable and wealthy Jews, the League was a source of embarrassment, just as the conduct of black radicals seemed to embarrass those blacks who believed themselves to be members of the bourgeoisie, or Afro-Saxons. In one JDL case, the testimony revealed that some young Jewish men passing the West 14th Street Armory noticed a piece of graffiti, not uncommon on walls and sidewalks of New York. Magic marker capitals said, "Jew, go home." The authors were doubtless the same ilk as those who would not wish to recognize the right of Israel to exist. The men stopped. One rang the armory bell. Someone peeked at him through an aperture in the door and demanded to know his mission. He stated his purpose, asking that the offending words be removed. He said that the man behind the door sneered and suggested, with an epithet, that the JDL member follow the advice offered by the protested legend. He returned to his friends. They purchased some spray paint approximately the same color as the facade of the armory's tan. They returned and covered the graffiti. They were arrested and in due course came before me, charged with criminal mischief that diminished the value of the property. But, as one witness put it, the same armory authorities had quickly obliterated earlier graffiti that said, "Avenge Attica." He said he felt if that writing could be removed, so too could the affront to the Jewish community. After hearing the testimony, I ruled from the bench that the young defendants had not diminished the value of the armory, but had improved the building by their act. The charges were dismissed, and the men were acquitted. I was so impressed by what I regarded as commendable zeal and a proper revolutionary spirit on the part of the defendants that I sought their aid and expertise in painting out the "Kill, Kill, Kill" inscription, which lashed together as final solution victims blacks, Jews, and Hispanics. I had long ago asked the building custodian to erase the writing before some aberrant patriot became so impressed that he undertook single-handedly to begin instant executions. I was told, however, in the robot fashion of civil service inflexibility, that the painting in the building was done only on a schedule, and that particular area was not due for another year or so. In a plot that could have ruined my judicial career, I arranged for my newly discovered allies to come to my chambers on the next weekend, where I would provide the paint for the obliteration of the murderous advice. But the jeopardy of a criminal mischief charge and the disgrace of being formally unfrocked were avoided at the last moment. When 5 young men arrived at the appointed hour, we proceeded with paint and brush to the guilty stairwell, only to discover that the wall had been newly painted, and officially so, for wet paint signs were neatly posted. Shortly thereafter, some JDL members were brought before my court, charged with jumping bail for an alleged earlier offense. They had been scheduled to go on trial 3 days from the time they were faced by the new charges. It seems that they were arrested at Kennedy Airport while on board an El Al plane headed for Israel. They had one-way tickets. The circumstances of how the arrest came about were not stated. I suggested to the assistant district attorney that the charges might have to be dismissed because no one could be accused of jumping bail until it was shown that he did not appear on a date when he was scheduled to be present in court. 3 days remained before the JDL members were due in court on the prior charges. I granted a short recess to the prosecutor to consider my analysis. At that point, the system's wrath reached out to demonstrate emphatically whose power was orchestrating justice. I was impressed with the minor and minority role played by judges, and in particular myself. The late Frank Hogan, New York's celebrated district attorney for more than 3 decades, was the beneficiary of a public relations coup. He enjoyed a national image as an angel of justice. He was nearly deified for his alleged impeccable propriety in running the country's busiest prosecutor's office. It was said that his was the one office that was wholly divorced from politics, and that only merit characterized his selection of young assistants. I had a different view of his reputation. He had once been in my chambers on a strange and unannounced mission. His chief of the Criminal Courts Bureau was with him and was allowed to interrupt me at lunch at my desk by telling me, "Judge, we just want you to know that the DA's office does not approve of anything you do. We read everything you write with the intention of appealing to a higher court." That was in 1972, when I was still a judicial neophyte. I was stunned by what I regarded as a threat to my independence and an effort to deter me. The impudence of such a visit was doubtless inspired by the protective cloak of the Hogan mythology. Somehow he had managed to create in the public mind and in the minds of politicians that he was an indispensable man of justice. I suggested that he seemed to be exhibiting the political power of his so-called non-political reputation, and I urged that his approval or disapproval of a judge's conduct be expressed elsewhere, and in a manner less likely to be regarded as an effort to tamper with a judge's exercise of discretion. I stated as well that the impromptu conference was unnecessary. If a judge strayed into error or violated judicial canons, onerous proceedings were available to attempt to unfrock or remove the judge. As the audacity of the invasion of my chambers became more apparent, I ended the audience with what I trusted was obvious curtness, and resumed eating my lunch and reading my newspaper. I could not imagine a district attorney or one of his emissaries confronting a white judge in such a manner. At the end of the recess in the JDL case then before me, the assistant district attorney sought to amend the charging information by making the offense attempted bail jumping. The possibilities of such a charge were fraught with the speculative happenstance of mind reading, and I offered the view that it too would have to be dismissed. I added further vexation to the prosecutor by noting that with today's supersonic planes, there could be no presumption that the young men could not return from Israel in time to keep their court appointments in New York. Suddenly there was an anxious conference away from the bench. I continued with other court business. Hogan's office was busy with the administrative judge who dictated the assignments of the criminal court judges, saying where they would sit and for what period. The whisper was that I had prejudged the case, and that the needs of justice required that the case be reassigned to a different judge. This was odd, because I had presumed the innocence of the young defendants, an ethic I had always thought constitutional. Shortly thereafter, one of the court clerks advised me that the case had been assigned to another judge, and that I had been disqualified from ever handling any other Jewish Defense League cases. The matter was transferred to Judge Milton Samarodin, who was known as a strict and severe conservative. The Legal Aid Society resented his exhibitions of hostility both toward them and their poor minority clients. They uncharitably referred to him by a name I am not at liberty to print here. Most judges, as might be expected, are the byproducts of politics in one way or another. Whether judges pay for their appointments to the bench has long been the subject of speculation. There have been many investigations through the years in efforts to uncover evidence of such corruption. I have been asked many times how much I paid for my appointment. I was told by one black lawyer that he had been expecting to get the appointment I received, and he asked me pointedly how much I paid to win preference over him. I was more amused than angered by such unflattering questions. The facts of my appointment by Mayor John V. Lindsay perhaps differ from the usual political appointments, as I have mentioned. In March 1971, about 1 year after my appointment, Life magazine carried an article entitled, "I Have Nothing to Do with Justice." It was the text of a long interview with Martin Erdman, who was then the chief trial counsel for the Legal Aid Society. He was quoted as having said, "There are so few trial judges who just judge, who rule on questions of law and leave guilt or innocence to the jury. And appellate division judges aren't any better. They're the whores who become madams. I would like to be a judge just to see if I could be the kind of judge I think a judge should be, but the only way you can get it is to be in politics or buy it, and I don't even know the going price." Such cynical observations moved the appellate division justices to prefer charges against Erdman. After long and expensive litigation, the Court of Appeals finally dismissed the charges, though taking the opportunity to voice disapproval of Erdman's taste, civility, morality, or ethics. 2 judges thought Erdman should have been censured for his remarks. It would have been interesting to know Erdman's feelings about judges as whores and madams, and his thoughts about buying judgeships. After he became a judge of the criminal court of New York City himself, he could be expected to harbor at least one critical metaphor concerning the system of criminal justice and its judges. Most judges seem to find the genesis of their position in their former political clubs. The ambitions of the clubhouse lawyer mandate certain base necessities. These urgencies do not vary as much between black and white political clubs as do the comparable rewards. Lawyers anxious to get profitable cases and attract their district leaders' attention must faithfully attend twice-weekly meetings and be generous in handing out free advice. Their doing so makes the club attractive, the leader a community resource, and results in mouth-to-mouth advertising for the selfless lawyers. The leader's rewards are the prestige and reputed money he gets from his occasional distribution of benefactions. Because the quota of political appointments available to black district leaders is limited, there is avid competition for appointments. Such quotas involve judgeships as well as other nominations that in a solidly Democratic area are synonymous with election. The fealty paid to a district leader by lawyers of ambition and favor seekers often makes sycophants of those who write their own obedient scripts and roles. An example, thought not to be isolated or unique, of how far obedience to a district leader may go to appease his ego or anger is found in the conduct of one of my former law partners, who was an active politician. In 1954, Herbert B. Evans and I practiced as partners in the same law firm. After a career of political appointments, he became the chief administrative judge for the state of New York, under the supervisory guidance of the chief judge of the Court of Appeals. When Averell Harriman ran for governor in 1955. Evans did volunteer work for a group of wealthy citizens working through the political club in Harlem of which he was a member. When Harriman won, the people with whom Evans had worked recommended that Evans be given a role as an assistant counsel to the new governor. Evans thus became the first black to occupy such an important office when Harriman conferred that favor. Evans' district leader in Harlem was furious because a member of his fiefdom had gone outside his power base to win a reward. Learning of his fearless leader's ire, Evans immediately sought to repair the damage. He appeared at the next meeting of his club in the guise of a sinner making public atonement through confession. He announced to the gathering that he wished to thank his leader for having interceded to make possible his appointment by the governor. He thereby appeased the leader's sense of propriety and local hegemony, and also reaffirmed the leader's fictitious statewide power. Both knew that the leader had nothing to do with Evans's appointment. Later, Evans became a justice of the appellate division of the Supreme Court. His elevation at various times is interesting because his merit is beyond dispute. As of this writing, he is the first and only black partner in the Shea Gold firm. Evans was always an extremely careful person. Because he and his wife had no children, he was able to devote one room of his Manhattan apartment to express his intellectual taste. At the entrance to the apartment, there was a table on which was prominently displayed a book of philosophy. It symbolized Evans' desire to create an impression he believed to be serviceable. In such great affection did he hold his self-image that after he and his first wife divorced, he effected a reconciliation with her before seeking public office. Both white and black judges are energized by political necessities in seeking what they believe to be the godly power of the black robe. Although there is no known formal college education to fit one for success in a political club, most club members who head for careers in the law do take certain prescribed courses that are thought to be helpful in preparing for law school. Presumably, lawyers who reach the bench have studied the political sciences, some business courses, white history, economics, and accounting. Few, however, have touched the heart of social work and the degraded society from which most criminal defendants come. Few white judges have black friends with whom they have shared intimate life experiences on the basis of close knowledge and affectionate regard and egalitarian esteem. The whites who become judges of the criminal court are all too often graduates of schools and colleges that teach the history of America within the boundaries of the usual heedless cliches of bare dates and occurrences. Whenever I have mentioned that Alexander Hamilton was said to have had a mother who was 1/8 Negro and was born on the West Indian island of Nevis, white judges have seemed astonished and unbelieving, as though I had invented an instant and fictitious biography. Consternation is intensified when I mention that Hamilton's mother had a long and lasting marriage with a man named Levine, and that his father remains such a shadowy figure that there has been some speculation that Hamilton himself was either a Levine or part Negro. I then offer the opinion that Hamilton, a handsome founding father, was never elected president because he was believed to be either Negro or Jewish. And those who have been bred on the romantic obscurantism of American history appear to be aghast. Of course, Hamilton could not have been president in any event since he was born outside the United States. It is not generally known that Hamilton's application for admission to Princeton University in the 1700s was rejected on the basis of racial consideration. Following the showing of Alex Haley's Roots to a national television audience, I was asked by a white judge what I thought about the excitement generated by the program. I said that it was about time white citizens were exposed to a historical past that had been a virtual secret to them. Perhaps, I said, whites could now get some vague idea of what it meant to be black in America and what a great miracle black survival had been. The judge replied that he thought the show was outrageously biased because it failed to show one good slave owner. He could see no contradiction in the use of the term good in conjunction with the moral corruption of slavery, a condition that made the Constitution a fraud to blacks. Unable to comprehend opposition of terms, he could not, of course, understand why he thought that blacks should have a special place in American society, or that the American sociology of slavery had any impact on both black and white life of today. Neither could he see anything but genetic humor in the white joke that Alex Haley adopted, thus reducing Roots to speculative imagination and a meaningless and maudlin display. The black world seems closed off from the white one. Whites seem to know less about blacks than blacks know about them. Black education in America, with its segregated inequality, has always been neglected. Now that public schools in many cities are predominantly black, the standards of segregation remain the norm. It is astonishing in a nation with so many colleges and universities that few people realize the abrasive debt that slavery and its consequences would inflict on future generations, with financial, emotional, and moral burdens that will be borne by many generations yet to come. With all of the passion and ritual Americans reserve for religion, it should not be stunning to discover in the country's ethos an incurable anti-intellectual turbulence. The hundreds of people who lined up before the United States Supreme Court the night before the Bakke case was to be argued were not there so much out of intellectual curiosity as to make certain, by their presence, that sacred American racial principles would not be destroyed. My fellow judges in the criminal court could discuss the surface details of this latest Supreme Court ruling as it came to them in precise form, but could grasp nothing of the socio-legal significance of black citizens having been compelled to do battle in the courts for the 200 years of the nation's existence to win what whites routinely took for granted and certified in the saying, free, white, and 21. Never having had to sue for the right to enter a public library, park, or swimming pool, never having attended a one-room shack masquerading as a schoolhouse, never having had to beg for the constitutional right to vote, to spend money to eat in a restaurant, to seek refuge in a hotel or inn, it was impossible for them to have genuinely humane feelings about blacks as persons, as opposed to black persons. None could see the analogy of black men begging for their manhood in white America. Their prejudice was built in and pre-shaped. They might never understand. The black endurance had been their experience. Hearing or reading about such constitutional travesties was the same to them as seeing a dull and pointless film dealing with unreal inventions. The everyday life and straightened posture of black existence in survival could never be felt by whites, even poor whites. Robert F. Kennedy, whom blacks revered, sought advice from some black intellectuals when he ran for the Senate from New York. But he had no patience with Lorraine Hansberry when she remarked that there was no use expecting blacks to act like whites until they were treated like whites. Because of such emotional and intellectual shortcomings, whites could both rejoice over and fear in the 1955 Supreme Court ruling that segregation in the public schools based on race was unconstitutional. Innocent optimists hailed the ruling as a giant step forward in human relations. It was not. What the court said, in effect, was that although segregation was illegal, the South could nevertheless continue its racist policies until it was convenient for the old Confederacy to make changes. The due and deliberate speed mentioned by the court became a national snail's pace, characterized by diversionary disputes over the role busing should or should not play in the purifying process. The decision itself, then, reeked of unconstitutionality because it upheld a constitutional affront. So powerful were the tenured congressional leaders and so confident were they that they could overcome this paper challenge to their way of life that they announced to the world how they proposed to flaunt the ruling. They regarded it as a trespass on their white aristocracy, and they revived antebellum ghost in an advertisement of arrogant white inhumanity. Old Sam Ervin, a self-styled country lawyer and former North Carolina judge, J. William Fulbright, and 88 other Southerners announced in Congress what they called their Declaration of Constitutional Principles. This brazen attempt at usurpation of the Supreme Court's mandate became known as the Southern Manifesto. The signers of that retrograde whimsy became reincarnated slave owners. It was as though Simon Legree had come out of retirement to lead them into a modern plantation society of slaves and master. If proof were needed to confirm the estrangement of blacks and whites, it can be found in that manifesto. Its leaders were all well-educated whites in positions of national power. They were not visibly poor white malcontent members of the Ku Klux Klan. Fulbright was regarded as scholarly and an internationalist, and Senator Ervin, a lawgiver, lent prestige to the manifesto's authority. Sam Ervin was also a giver of copies of the Constitution to all who came to visit him in Washington. Apparently, his gift included the emancipatory amendments. His retirement from the Senate was regarded with relief by blacks. The scandal of the Southern Manifesto was not known to have inspired outraged objections by white judges. Their silence could only be interpreted as tacit approval. The mute posture of black judges was a separate but equal disgrace. This happened in 1956, but seemed to hark back to 1857 to Dred Scott and to the doctrine of his case, which said no Negro had any rights that any white man was bound to respect. How could local judges in New York ever doubt that the proper treatment of black defendants in the criminal courts should find its origins in what our national leaders did? As judges, they were certainly not man the picket lines. Footnote: in 1985 and 1986, some judges did depart from their usual habits and manned picket lines outside the South African consul's office on Park Avenue, led by Robert Abrams, New York's Attorney General, who had his entire staff in the line on one of the coldest winter nights. End of footnote. In a show of insurgent disagreement with the manifesto's petulant exhibitionism, instead of acting, they continued to react. Judges always find it best not to be too controversial, and certainly it is in the best interest of their careers not to be thought to harbor controversial concerns, a strange phenomenon in a calling so fraught with disputation. Even with stalemates among the jurors, that very non-decision is the product of irreconcilable disagreement. Most judges, then, have assigned themselves the role of Olympians, presiding over dispute, but not engaging in it. This is doubtless one of the reasons for the slowness of the law to adopt changes. Enslavement to tradition is not always a sign of stability. All too often, it symbolizes inertia. In most societies, the law is allowed to act as the manager of overt human conduct, deciding what is proper, what is improper, and what sanctions to impose for breaches of propriety. Any inflexible allegiance to the past for definitions of conduct would be a denial of change and of the reasoning that should enlighten the law. Oliver Wendell Holmes, through his muscular descents over 3 decades of service as United States Supreme Court Justice, is generally regarded as a liberal by historians of the law. Yet he attacked leftists for emotionally taking up the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Holmes wrote to his friend Harold J. Lasky, "A thousandfold worse cases of Negroes came up from time to time, but the world does not worry over them." Neither did Holmes waste much worry over blacks. Possibly this was because, although he was a critic of the sometimes dead hand of the past on progress, his concern was for more arcane matters than equality for black citizens. White seemed to follow a rules of the game code of accepting other whites. It is as though life in America is an exclusively white club, and the members can do no wrong. Courtly white gentlemen from the South, whose sworn duty appears to be appeasing the worst elements of rural and urban prejudice against black existence, have always been accorded great honor. They were experts in filibusters that had as their aim the Christian oppression of black skin. Pious national leaders and their community churches could all unite in that essay of oppression known as the Southern Manifesto. They advertised their nation's rebuke to the Supreme Court for being so timid when it abandoned the claimed virtues of a slave society. These good Christians proclaimed the great danger to democracy from ignoring the historical propriety of the necessary place of the brutish black in American society. That men of national repute could conduct themselves in such an inhumane manner and without shame was a tribute to their power and the tolerance of a country which, in honoring them, upheld contempt for blacks. These were men, in the main, who had always lived a Southern manifesto even before one was formalized. They had come from sections of the country where the right of blacks to vote or to have a decent education had always been suppressed. Another Charles Sumner would be needed in the Congress to focus attention on the humanity of black citizens. I mention these things to give some description of the emotional and racial ecology in which those who became judges in this country were allowed to thrive, to prosper, and to reap great honor. America's caste system, which made blacks a separate and untouchable group, has all too often received negative leadership even from the White House. Franklin D. Roosevelt, long regarded by blacks and Jews as the earthly savior of the nation from the Great Depression and the fearless leader of the Allies, salvaging European civilization from the Nazis, was less than heroic in some ways. He emerges from the history of his time as an anti-Semite and a racist whose attitude toward blacks was one of abiding contempt. Blacks appeared to worship Roosevelt so passionately because they believed that he single-handedly abolished the Depression. Roosevelt presided over a phase of history of which I was a tiny part, that is, the racial segregation of American troops. The paradox of American soldiers as separate and unequal victims of democracy's racism fighting to destroy Hitler's racism seemed meaningless to Roosevelt. The great military heroes who came back from Europe and the Pacific in triumph, Douglas MacArthur, Omar Bradley, George Marshall, Mark Clark, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, all testified before Congress that the integration of the armed forces would be disastrous to the morale of the white troops. Little thought was given to the morale of the black soldiers and sailors. Many whites who served in the segregated forces and who accepted that argument as perfectly natural eventually became leaders at the bar and my colleagues on the bench. Their racial attitudes were products of a period when black naval personnel were restricted to the status of messmen, that is, floating domestics. When I asked them what they did during and before World War II to object to this racist travesty, they generally replied, "Nothing," and added, "After all, Bruce, it was national policy then." They were wrong, of course. National policy is declared by the Constitution and its amendments. What they meant was that it was a national practice of raw racism and a heedless flaunting of the Constitution, which they supported by not protesting. It was, in short, their way of admitting that they accepted the racial dichotomy as normal. They did not say, but may have suspected, that any overt declaration against racism by whites often resulted in such whites being called communist and worse, thus endangering their careers. Blacks simply were not worth that peril, and so they participated in the pageant that saw the mightiest fighting force in the world carefully divided into racial categories. Lawyers, young men who would become lawyers, and judges played an active and supportive role in American racism. They were indispensable parts of a national oppression. They were in the conservative mold of the typical American lawyer. I never ceased to remind my white colleagues of the repressive influences that were allowed to shape their thinking on race and created so much social distance between them and all blacks, including those of educational and artistic standing. My words did not ingratiate me with the judges of my generation. Except for one or two white judges, my relationship with my fellow jurists was one of surface courtesies and an occasional exchange of greetings. I had no love for them and less respect. Early in my career, I had protested to Judge James Leff that most of my colleagues did not speak to me. With characteristic bite and cynical insight, he said, "It's a fringe benefit." Other than Arthur Blinn, for whom I have the highest respect and affectionate regard, I have never wished to chat with any of them. I consider most of them as an abject lot, religiously devoted to obedience to the dictates of court administration as a way of advancing their own promotion within what I regard as a Neanderthal system. Although they might grumble quietly, they are obedient to their administrative infrastructure, knowing that steadfast allegiance will promote their careers and that criticism would accomplish the opposite. Under our system, judges who depose of the greatest number of cases in the shortest possible time are the ones most favored. Perhaps they are much wiser than I. They saw how I was treated. For them to avoid similar treatment was certainly not unreasonable. Justice in such hands becomes a numbers game, in which questions of humanity are disposed of summarily. Put bluntly, success in the game meant disposing of as many black and Hispanic bodies as possible. This was done by exacting pleas of guilty or by conducting speedy trials. Prosperity in such statistics wins one a promotion as an acting Supreme Court justice. That temporary glory results in an increase in pay and prestige, those indispensable symbols of American success. The increase in pay and prestige, not to mention power, served as powerful goads to comply with the system's reward for such conduct. Further inspiration was discovered in the possibility of a nomination to run for a 14-year term as a Supreme Court justice without the limiting qualification of the word acting before one's name. For the most part, a numbers game was ensured, and one's career was reduced to a batting average statistic. Each month, a mimeographed sheet reported how many cases the judges had and how many had been disposed of, either by trial or by pleas of guilty. No similar reports revealed a judge's wisdom or how he had served the ends of justice. The anxiety of my criminal court colleagues in avoiding any trouble with the administrative hierarchy made them experts at glad-handing and backslapping, as though the court were just another back room of their favorite political club. It was easy to become adept at ignoring the genuine issues that always troubled the court. Early in 1971, there were constant bomb scares, and at least one bomb exploded in the building. The two presiding justices of the first and second judicial departments convened an emergency meeting of the criminal court judges to discuss what course to follow in the event of a catastrophe. The steps to be taken in the event of an explosion or even a rumor that a bomb had been hidden in the courthouse were outlined. After speeches by the two presiding justices, praising the manner in which all court personnel had bravely carried on despite the dangers posed by radicals protesting the war in Vietnam, the floor was opened for questions from the assembled judges. One judge, who had many years' experience and was a member of a distinguished family, stood up and asked, "Is it true that we will have a 4-day weekend for the 4th of July?" Such a question reflects on what ranks as the most urgent concern of a judicial officer, as opposed to serious exploration of the humanitarian issues that are always raised by charges and the prosecution and the defense of criminal trials. The police have easy access to sympathetic media. The officers who work in the courts, call the calendars, and keep order are all ambitious to become real police officers. In the meantime, they carry prominently displayed weapons and are known as peace officers. They have great affection for the policemen they like so much to imitate, and they act as spies for the PBA, reporting gossip they believe the police should know about certain judges. The assistant district attorneys also eagerly call the press whenever they want negative publicity for a judge they do not like. With the police, the district attorneys and the court officers are Bruce watchers. My slightest disagreement with the police was quickly reported to the newspapers and television stations. My most casual expression of criticism directed at the police becomes in the minds of the officers an indefensible indictment. In a time of great criminal activity and public fear about safety in the streets, the police were extremely effective in polishing their own image as frontline guardians of the common weal. This was their way of exploiting fear and near hysteria in the city, as they sought to demonstrate that, despite their heroic efforts, the judges were undoing their brave labors. Few citizens questioned the effectiveness of New York's finest, or remembered the scandals or corruption that, from time to time, revealed a very human side of the police. Hardly anyone deplored the resistance of the police to the periodic suggestions that they should live in the city they were sworn to protect 24 hours a day. In effect, they justified their flight to the white suburbs, away from the object of their protection. The constant barrage of police propaganda has helped create a cynical mood among the public. The canon of the criminal law that one is presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt seems now to be suspect. After the arrest of a suspect, Few citizens are content to wait for a trial or the presentation of evidence. The hysteria and fear of the times call for immediate justice, and this results in instant conviction in the public mind. The police have seldom failed to emphasize their role as heroic bulwarks of salvation in a world of desperate criminal cruelty. Some of the police have been sturdy heroes indeed. Many of the young officers appear to take their calling seriously, and they devote a professional zeal to their work. Others have become cynical. Many of the latter are seen in courts during off-duty hours, sometimes both day and night, with those they have arrested. Sitting around court, waiting for an arraignment of their captives is one way of earning $15 per hour in overtime, and all too often, many of the arrests seem to have been made only for the purpose of collecting the overtime pay. To make an arrest look serious, some officers will charge the defendant with a felony when they know that the charge is likely to be reduced at some point by the district attorney. And when charges are reduced, the officer can shake his head as though in wonderment that administrative villains can so callously undo his heroism. It is the expression of the officer's anger, whether real or feigned, that the television audience sees when an officer is interviewed. In one case in which a white defendant was charged with homicide, my analysis of the facts as they were presented to me indicated that the death of the victim was an accident following a flare-up between former friends. The deceased had been knocked down in a fist fight with his friend. He arose and walked away and died shortly thereafter. I released the defendant without bail. He had no money. The next day, the headlines in the press and the reports on television made it appear that I had let loose on the unsuspecting community the most dangerous and depraved criminal ever to walk the streets. When the same homicide charge was dismissed by a white judge some weeks later, one could discover that fact only by searching fine print for an item so small it amounted to no more than a brief footnote. The police had found in me the perfect foil and a judicial officer they could depict as a foe of law and order. This aided and abetted their own careers, making it appear that even the courts opposed the doing of a policeman's duty, although the charge was prostitution. The Daily News hailed him as a latter-day messiah of morality, as though that oppressive act had not only been correct, but had also eliminated the second oldest profession once and for all. Knowingly or unwittingly, judges often fine prostitutes, then parole them to earn the fine. Judges who do this are known as Johns, since it is to them that the illegal earnings are brought. By 1972, I had become the focus of an unceasing police ire. In one of his 1978 columns in the Daily News, Jimmy Breslin, commenting on one police attack directed toward me, suggested that the police had selected me as their favorite target for two principal reasons. One was that I had become a symbol to be exploited as an example of the grave difficulties with which they had to cope, and I was pictured as archetypical of a criminal justice system that ignored police valor and exhibited more sympathy for criminals than for the police. The result, of course, was to divert attention from the criminal conduct of the police themselves. In addition, as Breslin said, there could be nothing better as a whipping boy than a black man in his 50s. The police were powerfully assisted in their advertisements by the fact that their pronouncements were generally accepted as little less than Holy Writ and ex cathedra bulls from an infallible lay Vatican. The term "turn 'em loose, Bruce" dramatized the contempt in which I was held by the police. On the question of detaining defendants simply to keep them off the street and under arrest until they could be tried, few recalled that in 1970 the state legislature had specifically rejected any semblance of preventive detention in New York. Preventive detention, of course, is wholly destructive of the traditional American presumption of innocence because it is based on the theory that pretrial confinement prevents a defendant from doing the same thing again. Police officers who are arrested and charged naturally believe passionately in pretrial release on their own recognizance and in honoring the presumption of innocence. One of the troubles with the police department is that from its earliest days as a formal organization and until recently, it has been dominated by what has become to be known as the Irish Mafia. The Irish came to believe that the department belonged to them. It was their territorial imperative. They exhibited a spirit of protective ownership. The failure of the potato crop in Ireland in 1846 and 1847 brought millions of Irish immigrants to America through the port of New York. The subjugation of the Irish by the English dated back some 200 years before the potato famine, and had generated so powerful a hate among the Irish that many believed that the famine itself was an English abomination. Numerous pacification expeditions to Ireland by British forces and the presence of English policing on that island have given the Irish a historical detestation for English authority. At the same time, so many were arriving in New York, one of the first sights greeting them on the streets was police officers dressed like English constables. Offended by such symbols of detested British authority, young bands of Irish bully boys adopted the habit of waylaying the officers and beating them. So vexed were the administrators of police authority that they sought to eliminate such beatings by allowing the officers to dress in mufti and wear only copper stars or shields of their authority. This resulted in insults being hurled at the officers by the young Irish street marauders, who called the officers coppers. That term has since been shortened to cop and accepted, even by the police, as the name for an honorable profession. Nevertheless, the police continued to be victims of the roaming and generally unemployed gangs, and finally, the administrators adopted a kind of reverse policy of, if they continue to beat us, let's join them. The Irish bully lads were adopted as police officers almost wholesale, without the intellectual impediment of a civil service examination. Policing became a virtual Irish monopoly in New York, and many other Irish immigrants came to America specifically to become police officers in the city. Yet, America's vaunted hospitality to immigrants was not always kind to the Irish. They were the poor of New York, along with the city's blacks. Indeed, the Irish were known as white niggers, and they competed with the blacks for the lowest jobs available, one of which was emptying outhouses, primitive conveyances common in New York City before plumbing and sewage disposal became modernized. As is all too often the case, when the poor compete among themselves for the crumbs of society, the black and white poor came to hate each other, each seeing in the other minority some deprivation of themselves. So acute was the mutual detestation that by the time of the Civil War, when a man eligible for military duty could purchase exemption by paying $300, the poor Irish, who were militarily white, could not afford that luxury. In angry resentment both at their poverty and at the supposed cause of the war, the abolition of slavery, the young Irish rebelled against enlisting in the Union Army by parading through the streets of New York. They yelled that they were not going to fight to free the niggers. they were otherwise disposed to fighting. However, for their hostile progress through the streets allowed them to beat Negroes and even burn down the colored orphan home, along with any poor unfortunates who remained in that doomed building. Thus was crystallized an ethnic tradition of dislike and suspicion directed at the blacks by the Irish, whose protective coloration and success as modern Americans give no clue of their disturbed past as victims of discriminations that rival those historically reserved for blacks. The power of the Irish in modern New York society is such that, despite the recent prominence of Italians and others in the ranks of the police department, no mayor of New York, with two exceptions, has dared appoint any person as police commissioner who was not Irish Catholic. Theodore Roosevelt once served as commissioner, and Mayor Edward I. Koch appointed Benjamin Ward to that office as the first black commissioner. It seems that the entire department has adopted a view of blacks which acts out the ancient observation that the oppressed, when liberated, become the oppressors. That oppression is reflected in different ways, other than by the use of raw and brutal force against blacks and Hispanics. The force used, however, is just as deadly in its side effects. For many years, blacks were not even considered as possible candidates for appointment to the force. It was not until 1911 that Manhattan saw its first black officer, and he remained a lonely quota of one for a long, long time. An enormous man, Samuel Battle, resembled Jack Johnson in stature, and this appearance of being able to live up to his name contributed largely to his survival in the private club hostility of the department. Anyone aware of the history of the Irish in New York believes that the hostility between the police and the blacks stems from the ancient competition between the two groups when both were regarded and treated as niggers of different colors. With their protective coloration, the Irish have so far progressed in American society that one no longer even hears the contemptuous mention that used to distinguish the shanty toughs from the lace-curtain gentility among them. It is not only the deadly violence of police brutality against blacks that illustrates the traditional antagonism. Now and then, the police attitude is expressed in other ways. One illustration may be found in an incident that occurred in 1952. A black man, Billy Rowe, was walking along Park Avenue on his way to visit his friend, Ed Sullivan, the television personality. A white woman was walking just in front of him. Apparently, she got the impression, through vanity or otherwise, that Rowe was following her. She saw a police squad car and summoned the white officers to rescue her from the danger of her imagined pursuer. An officer called out to Rowe, "Hey you!" Rowe at first ignored the call. It came again. Looking at the officer evenly, Rowe replied, "If you wish to speak to me, I have a name." The officer then said, "Just a minute there, I'm a police officer." Rowe said, "Oh, are you? Well, then I happen to be one of your bosses." He then exhibited his shield. He was at the time the first black deputy police commissioner in the country. The officers retreated in some embarrassment. The damsel in distress must have been puzzled by their sudden disappearance. The national police organizations appeared at one time to have taken instructions from the racist persuasion of officers from the South, a time when lynchings of blacks seemed normal, especially when the police themselves were participants in such gory carnivals. Dr. David Musto of Yale University, in his book The American Disease, cites the influence of racist myths and rumor in convincing policemen that not only were blacks addicted to the use of cocaine, but that it made black skins virtually impervious to the 32 caliber bullet, and that officers need 38 caliber weapons to shoot blacks. That American police departments now have the 38 caliber weapon as their standard arm is a reflection of what a widely held racist view can accomplish. It was also thought that the Negro's fondness for cocaine stimulated his sexuality, thus making white women vulnerable to black rape. This general fear of the Negro and the feeling of necessity for keeping him in his place was encouraged by such ethnic gossip, and also included apocrypha that the Negro's marksmanship was sharpened and perfected by his use of cocaine. Coca-Cola, which used to contain cocaine, was thought, for that reason, to be the favorite refreshment of America's Negro underclass. The persuasive power of the police has not stopped at the press, which understandably might over-dramatize cause and effect so as to aid and abet the sale of newspapers. Now and then, the courts and judges reveal an urgent necessity to ally themselves with the police sentiment, even though the vocations of the police and the court are strikingly different. In the Grutola case, masses of police demonstrated in the courtroom their noisy disagreement with allowing the defendant to be at the qualified liberty represented by his ability to meet the low bail I had imposed. It was Christmas, went one argument, and while Officer Dowd lay in the hospital struggling to recover from a critical wound, he was deprived of the usual holiday celebrations with his wife and children. The press had also emphasized the police outcry that Grutola was out in the streets, at liberty to do again what he had then only been accused of doing. That all of the actors in the Grutola incident were white did not remove the taint of racism. The attack on me had been so virulent that it practically linked my sympathies with criminals who shoot or slay police officers. Almost immediately after I reinstated the same bail condition for Grutola's release, he was indicted, and the dispute was removed to the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. There he was arraigned before Judge George Postel, who set his bail at $25,000. Not a whisper of protest was heard from the police, even though Grutola meant the bail and, as the police theory went, was free to do the same thing again. Judges Kleiman and Postel are both white. The reactions the press, the police, and the public established in burning italics that so far as society was concerned, a black judge should understand his enslaved place. My assignment to night court during the Christmas and New Year holidays was in itself an interesting piece of racial punishment. One of the veteran clerks in the court, seeing me appear for duty in that last week of December, exclaimed, "Jesus Christ, I've been here for over 30 years, and this is the first time I have ever seen a Christian judge here for the Christmas holidays." He had automatically assumed that I was a Christian, because except for those emotional radicals who accepted Islam and changed their names, American blacks seemed to pay allegiance to the same Christianity as the slave owners. In fact, I subscribed to no Christian or other sect. The court administrators simply assumed that I did. The practice had always been, however, that the Jewish judges did duty on Jewish holidays. The administrators further assumed that I must be made to pay a price and learn a lesson for my bail policies, which caused them so much distress by focusing attention on their system. Michael Donson, now a state Supreme Court judge but then counsel to Mayor John Lindsay, stopped me in the street one day. In what he must have regarded as the friendliest of ways, he said to me, "What the hell is wrong with you, Bruce? When you and Howard Rothwax were appointed, you were two of Lindsay's stars." He then warned that I was jeopardizing any chance of promotion because of my bail policies. "Settle down," was his last remonstrative advice to me. Later, after the inauguration of the infamous Rockefeller laws regarding narcotics, the then governor was making wholesale appointments of acting Supreme Court justices to preside over the increasing number of narcotics prosecutions. At that time, Johnson had felt it necessary to explain why I would have been one of the appointees had I been obedient to his earlier warnings to settle down. I accepted the holiday assignment without protest. It was my job. Nevertheless, I was well aware of what the court administrators were doing. Any time a judge offends the administrators by public criticism, they simply give the offending judge what is regarded as a harsh assignment or one thought to be disagreeable. For me, it was the kind of abuse without due process that white employers have long been able to inflict on powerless blacks with impunity. Earlier, I had been assigned to a court in Brooklyn, although almost without exception, Manhattan judges are kept in that borough. Weary one day of hearing the district attorney's office answer the call of the day's calendar by saying that the people were ready for trial, although both he and I knew that a particular case would not be reached that day, I made an announcement from the bench. I stated in plain English that most of the defendants were either black or Puerto Rican and poor, that some of them had jobs, that the district attorney should learn who was employed and stop taking the defendants away from their work when they knew that the cases of those persons could not possibly be reached for trial, and that by missing a number of days of work, the defendants would inevitably be discharged and be cast on the public dole, becoming a burden on the taxpayer's purse. I concluded by saying that cases answered ready but not actually prepared then to proceed to trial would be dismissed. This was immediately translated into, "So long as I am on the bench, no blacks or Puerto Ricans will ever serve time." Shortly thereafter, I was struck by the fact that while police officers invariably described the race of each defendant as the prosecution's testimony was given, it seldom varied. I observed the male white Puerto Rican perpetrator. It would go. It seemed that all one needed to avoid the jeopardy of being black was to have a Spanish surname, for all too often the male white Puerto Rican perpetrator was quite as black as any of those known as black. I asked several officers if they had been instructed to make such descriptions in their police academy training, and each said yes. I then proceeded to dismiss a series of cases for mistaken identification, since the Hispanics were as dark as I am. Naturally, this conduct was dutifully reported to the district attorney, who called David Ross, then the new administrative judge for the city's courts. I was summarily transferred to Manhattan. Brooklyn's supervisory judge, there is one for each county, said that as long as he, Ludwig C. Glower, was on the bench, I would never again sit in Brooklyn. Alas, poor Glower was not to sit there much longer. He felt the sting of the law when he was indicted for alleged bribe-taking, an indictment that was subsequently dismissed, but only after it had done its pernicious mischief. When I protested my summary removal and demanded an investigation, Ross said, with a pious and impeccable imitation of Ananias, that he had already conducted an investigation and that everything was in order. I asked how there could have been an investigation if no one had asked me any questions. This remark was taken as impertinent and brushed aside. I then said that the only reason for my transfer was a telephoned request from the district attorney in Brooklyn, which suggested that the district attorney Not the administrators ran the court system. Ross exploded, denying that he knew Eugene Gold, although referring to him as a piss ant in the same breath. Ross concluded his interview with me, which I had been compelled to demand, by using the most vulgar and profane language imaginable. He seemed incurably coarse in his cigar-smoking resemblance to a Class B actor imitating a benevolent tough guy. Despite his South Bronx origins, he appeared to have no understanding or feel for sociology, relishing only his role as a boss. After assuring me that because I was a Manhattan judge, I belonged in Manhattan, he immediately had me transferred to duty in the Bronx. Ross is an interesting character. He is a short and affable man to whom political preference is gospel and power a treasure. By his own admission, he escaped the harsh reality of his youthful residence in the South Bronx, although he retained its tough mannerisms of speech. During my audience with him, he was surrounded by an admiring claque of white Confederates who approvingly smiled and made occasional laudatory interjections. Each looked tougher than the other, as though ready to take on roles as underworld power brokers. Their appearance was wholly destructive of the profession's claim to being one that is learned and dignified. I had been astonished to learn that most of them were lawyers. My youthful experiences with Judge James S. Watson had fixed in my mind the image of a judge as a model of dignified propriety, careful speech, scholarship, and wisdom. After all, the law was the second oldest profession, and one hoped, clearly distinguishable from the first. In a single outburst, David Ross destroyed the illusion of learning and shattered every concept of dignity with a demonstration of crude and wide-ranging irrelevancies. It was difficult for me to remind myself that I was in the presence of a powerful jurist. His language was riddled with a toughness of expression and colorful adjectives not generally associated with the judicial image. It was easy to feel that he was talking down to me, seeking a touchstone that would activate in me something resembling his own bluff affability. My sense of shame was late in arriving, and I sank to the same poverty-stricken level as Ross. As I retreated from his presence, I told him that he and the system had treated me as a nigger, but he was mistaken if he believed that I was anyone's nigger. As I left, I sought to slam the door, only to be frustrated by its automatic governor, which would not permit that gesture. After that confrontation, Ross did not speak to me again for 5 years. In various ways, however, he undermined administrative objectivity and subjected me to an administrative punishment without charges or a hearing. For about 18 months, I was restricted to a so-called youth part, where my sole duty was to stamp approval on the papers of young offenders who had completed counseling and qualified to have their charges dismissed in the interest of justice. I was not allowed to try cases, conduct hearings, or decide motions. My courtroom was a tiny back room with peeling paint, infested with roaches and mice. The Patrolmen's Benevolent Association claimed credit for my internal banishment, but never relented in its efforts to have me removed from the bench. The police seemed to resent the advances of the civil rights movement and the desire for power which blacks had begun to express. It was easy to imagine that the police were the agents of those who opposed any equality for blacks. Officers routinely stopped large and expensive cars driven by blacks, simply to harass and annoy the drivers. If a black dared drive with a white woman companion, he was especially likely to be stopped by white officers. They seemed to wish to teach blacks that they had a place and to remember who the boss was. In my private practice as a lawyer, I've represented many black musicians. Many of them owned large and expensive cars. Some had white wives. Often I was asked to drive a wife home from where her husband was performing. Many times I was stopped for no real reason and questioned extensively as officers stared at my companion. As 1974 came to an end, I was suddenly summoned to substitute for a Jewish judge who had to leave court early to observe a holiday. As though scheduled by a disgruntled karma, a black defendant was brought before me. He was charged with an entire catalog of traffic misdemeanors and offenses. The assistant district attorney moved to dismiss some charges and allow the defendant to plead guilty to a minor offense such as driving without a license, and this was done. I imposed the mandatory fine and the defendant departed after being given time within which to pay. The arresting officer, obviously unhappy about the reduced charges and the relatively mild penalty, followed the defendant out of the courtroom. I noticed some activity just outside the entrance to the courtroom, but did not know what it was. Suddenly, the black defendant came rushing back in. His hair was disheveled, his face was angry, and he had the appearance of one who was at loss without his spectacles. He asked to be heard and said that the arresting officer had followed him and demanded the right to search him. The defendant said he would not submit. The officer had drawn his weapon, clicked off the safety, and pointed it at the defendant's head. The search was then conducted. No weapon or other contraband was discovered. The defendant said that the officer had been distressed and had remarked, "You're not going to get away that lightly," before taking his gun from its holster. After the officer conferred with the district attorney, the latter said that the officer had wished to search the defendant to protect the court personnel because he knew the defendant had been charged a number of times with possession of a dangerous weapon. He concluded that the officer had taken proper police action. In some heat, I asked the officer how he was protecting the court when, knowing the defendant's record, he waited to make the search after the defendant had left the courtroom. There was no answer. It became clear to me that personal petulance and irrationality had caused the officer to act in a rash and reckless manner. I stated that I had been sickened by the killing of 10-year-old Clifford Grover, a black child, by a white police officer, not to mention the deaths of other blacks at the hands of trigger-happy officers. I added that something drastic should be done about killer cops and those who seemed on the verge of becoming such, especially those making their targets black flesh and life. I suggested that this officer should be deprived of his weapon. His consequent flush appeared to signal the onset of an apoplectic seizure, and I refused to listen to anything else. His immediate complaint, through the PBA, was made to the Judiciary Relations Committee of the Appellate Division. It demanded that I be removed from the bench, and I began another series of the appearances I was to make before that grim-faced committee, a well-dressed assemblage of Star Chamber functionaries who never permitted an accused judge to confront his accuser. To come before such a body is to believe that humanity's sense of humanity has all but fled. Each judge and lawyer on the committee sat with piles of papers and transcripts before him. An official court reporter sat near the head of the table, ready to record each syllable. It was obvious that they were all impressed with the power of the PBA and its complaint that I had offended one of its members. But no matter what charge was against me, the committee always focused on the subject of bail, as though the exercise of my judicial discretion in releasing defendants before their trial was an unwritten crime in itself. In my anger at such a gross trespass on my time and sense of dignity, I bridled at appearing before people who seemed not to know anything about the reality of judging the underworld in that arena known as the criminal court. The committee seemed never to shrink from its addiction to the belief that a judge should be presumed guilty from the outset. I was just another black defendant. On the occasions when I appeared before the committee, there were always at least two black members. One, Herbert B. Evans, had been, as mentioned previously, one of my law partners. The hearing strayed from the PBA complaint and wandered off into an inquisition into words spoken by me in public speeches and law school lectures. I had always harped on the apartheid of South Africa as compared with the constitutional apartheid I perceived in the American way of life. In a lecture at the New York Law School on the disparity in sentencing and the harshness of sentences imposed on blacks and Hispanics as opposed to those imposed on whites, I commented on the change in the population of the state's prisons in recent years from white to black and Spanish. I said that the prisons of New York had become black and Hispanic zoos with mostly white keepers. The committee suggested that that was not a proper comment for a sitting judge to make to a law school audience. I had always imagined that students of law should be exposed to the realities of the profession. I was admonished to mind my tongue in the future. It was made plain to me that I was not to exercise freedom of speech and that the First Amendment's guarantees stopped at the courthouse door, even though I had never made such remarks in a courtroom. My lecture was thought worthy by Congressman Herman Badillo and Charles Rangel, however, and they caused its entire text to be published in an issue of the Congressional Record. The New York Law Journal also published the remarks under the headline, "An Angry Judge Speaks Out." This incident occurred at about the same time that Judge William F. Suglia was brought before the same Committee on Judicial Relations. Suglia is white. He had invited a black woman to his chambers, and there, with overtures she found offensive, they discussed charges against her nephew. She reported this incident to the office of the administrative judge. In a subsequently arranged rendezvous with the judge, the woman taped some of his proposals. For this offense, Suglia was censored. That is, a negative mention was entered into his record as a judge. It made me wonder what would happen to me if I invited a white woman to my chambers and made offensive overtures to her. Dennis Brogan, the English sociologist, once described America as an air-conditioned nightmare. I wondered why I could not make such an understated summary of America, since I at least had had the experience that could have compelled this diagnosis of the country's ethos. Perhaps I was too busy with the experience of life in living color. I had some time before perceived the American reaction to color to be synonymous with a conspiracy to de-develop the black persona and keep blacks so busy defending their right to exist that all of their energies would be diverted and they would thus retrogress, becoming officially the American untouchables, its aboriginals, caught in a static posture of non-evolvement. We were not even supposed to reach the status of that exceptional African whom the French colonial masters contemptuously referred to as the Evolue.